In A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, James Joyce crafts an intricate psychological and spiritual portrait of Stephen Dedalus as he struggles toward self-definition and artistic independence. While much of the novel is dominated by Stephen's consciousness and inner conflicts, his mother, Mary Dedalus, occupies a subtle yet powerful position in the narrative. She is at once a figure of affection, guilt, and moral constraint, representing the intertwined forces of family, religion, and Irish identity that Stephen seeks to transcend. Role in the narrative. Mary Dedalus's role in the novel is not that of a central actor, but of a moral and emotional touchstone. She is rarely at the forefront of the plot. Instead, she exists in the margins in prayers, memories, and silences. Her influence operates indirectly, shaping Stephen's inner world and moral sensibility. From the novel's opening pages, she appears as a nurturing, protective presence. The young Stephen recalls the smell of her hair and the touch of her hand, as among his earliest sensations, which situate her as a source of warmth and safety within the chaotic and often harsh social environment of the Dedalus household. However, as Stephen matures, this relationship grows increasingly fraught. Mary Dedalus represents a form of traditional piety and domestic order that Stephen finds suffocating. Her devotion to the Catholic faith and her hope that her son will conform to its moral expectations create an enduring source of conflict. This is most evident in the later chapters, when Stephen refuses to perform his Easter duty, the confession and communion required of Catholics. His mother's distress over this act encapsulates the emotional cost of Stephen's rebellion. His intellectual freedom demands that he wound the person he loves most deeply. Her role thus evolves into that of the moral conscience of the novel, not because she embodies rational morality, but because her suffering becomes a mirror for Stephen's internal struggle. When he rejects her religious appeals, he is also rejecting the emotional and spiritual comfort of home. Mary's sorrow, conveyed through her quiet endurance rather than argument, forces the reader to perceive the human cost of Stephen's self-assertion. Symbolic significance. Symbolically, Mary Dedalus represents the trinity of mother, religion, and Ireland, a triad that Joyce develops throughout his works as interlinked sources of devotion and bondage. She embodies the emotional power of maternal love, but also its capacity to bind the individual to a system of obligation and guilt. In Stephen's eyes, she is part of the nets that hold him back from flight. Family affection, national duty, and religious faith. Her motherhood aligns her with the Virgin Mary, to whom she is often implicitly compared. Just as Catholic devotion to the Virgin demands humility and obedience, Mary Dedalus's maternal love is infused with religious sentiment and sacrifice. Her constant prayers for her son's soul and her distress at his spiritual defiance position her as a pious intercessor, both loving and constraining. To Stephen, however, this Marian association becomes a form of entrapment. The Virgin symbolizes the moral ideals of purity and submission that he must escape to achieve his identity as an artist. At the same time, Mary Dedalus symbolizes Ireland itself, nurturing yet paralyzed by faith and tradition. Her inability to challenge her husband's financial incompetence or assert authority within the household mirrors Ireland's political and cultural subjugation. Although Mary Dedalus is essentially a background figure, her emotional resonance is profound. She represents the unspoken moral tension that haunts Stephen's intellectual life. He feels both love and resentment toward her. Love for her gentleness and loyalty, resentment for her insistence on religious obedience. The dynamic between them dramatizes one of the novel's central psychological conflicts, the struggle between affection and autonomy. Stephen's guilt over rejecting his mother's faith underscores the persistence of his emotional dependence. His rebellion is intellectual, yet his conscience remains bound to her suffering. Through Mary Dedalus, Joyce reveals that the pursuit of artistic freedom is never purely heroic. It is also an act of emotional violence. Broader implications. Mary Dedalus's significance extends beyond the personal or domestic realm. She embodies the moral structure of Ireland that Joyce critiques throughout his works, a structure built on piety, repression, and the idealization of suffering women. Her life is defined by endurance. She bears poverty, disappointment, and the disintegration of her family without protest. In doing so, she mirrors the condition of many Irish women of her time, trapped within the twin institutions of family and church. Her relationship with Stephen thus becomes an allegory for the conflict between modern individualism and traditional morality. In rejecting his mother's pleas, Stephen symbolically rejects the entire system of belief that has governed Irish life. Yet Joyce does not present this as a simple victory. Stephen's artistic awakening is shadowed by emotional loss and alienation. Mary Dedalus's sorrow marks the moral and emotional price of intellectual freedom. Furthermore, her presence underscores the limitations of patriarchal structures. While Simon Dedalus dominates through bluster and nostalgia, Mary's quiet endurance sustains the family's survival. She represents moral integrity amid chaos, yet her lack of agency exposes the gendered imbalance of power within both the family and Irish society. Joyce's portrayal of her suffering, silent, devout, and unacknowledged, critiques a culture that venerates the idea of the Holy Mother, while silencing real women's voices. Conclusion: Mary Dedalus, though a peripheral character in terms of dialogue and action, stands at the emotional and symbolic heart of a portrait of the artist as a young man. She represents the moral universe that Stephen must both honor and transcend. As a mother, she embodies tenderness and faith. As a symbol, she incarnates the intertwined forces of religion, family, and national identity that define and confine Irish life. Through her, Joyce dramatizes the cost of artistic and spiritual emancipation. To forge an identity free of inherited beliefs, one must break the most intimate bonds. Yet Mary's presence also reminds the reader that love and devotion, however constraining, are integral to human identity. Stephen's rejection of her prayers may mark his liberation, but it also leaves an emotional void that art alone cannot fill. In this sense, Mary Dedalus is more than a character. She is the novel's enduring conscience, a silent embodiment of the compassion, faith, and suffering that Stephen's art must one day rediscover if it is to achieve true humanity.